Hello, and welcome to Return to the Fire with Wild Women, the podcast that seeks to reignite wisdom aligned with the regeneration of people and the planet. I'm your host, Kim Carfore, founder of the 501c3 nonprofit Wild Women, and I'm so glad that you joined us today. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Return to the Fire with Wild Women. I'm your host, Kim Carfore, and today I'm so excited to introduce Chantel Noa Forbes. Chantal Noa is a transdisciplinary scholar, storyteller, and educator working at the intersection of ecology, spirituality, and culture. Chantel Noa her work examines the environmental significance of decolonial and Indigenous perspectives on multi-species ontology, more than human personhood and Indigenous sovereignty. Before earning her PhD, Dr. Forbes spent 20 years working in social documentaries, environmental media, and agricultural communications across Africa, Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe. So Dr. Forbes has been a visiting assistant professor of anthropology at Randolph-Macon College in Virginia and is an adjunct faculty member at the California Institute of Integral Studies and Pacifica Graduate Institute in California. Dr. Forbes currently lives in Gurambibara, Queensland, Australia, whose traditional owners and custodians are the Wulu Gurukaba and the Bindal peoples. If I butchered that, please correct me, and I'm sorry about that pronunciation if it wasn't done well. But welcome, Dr. Forbes. Happy to have you on the podcast. So, you have described yourself as a transnational scholar with the global majority, which includes both human and more than human communities. Can you say a little bit more about your origin story, this identity, and how you got into this work?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Carfore. I'm really pleased to join you today. And thank you for those introductions. Today, I am joining you from Gurumbimbala, which is the Aboriginal name for Townsville, Queensland, Australia, which is in Northern Australia. And the traditional custodians here are the Wilgurukaba people, who are known as the people of the canoe. We're sitting here on the edge of the Coral Sea, at the edge of the Great Barrier Reef. And this is also the traditional territories of the Bindal peoples. So that brings me to my own origin story. I was born and raised in South Africa. I lived in various places across the country, and I was born in the 80s at the end of apartheid. So it was a very difficult time, sort of marked by a lot of political unrest, a lot of violence, a lot of oppression. And this time period between the early 80s and the mid 90s, when the country was transitioning from apartheid rule to its first democratic government, had a very big impact on my life. In addition to that, the kind of work that my parents did also impacted me greatly. My parents worked in social development, which took us across the country. It meant that we moved around a lot, and also that we spent time in spaces that not many children would have had the opportunity to spend time in. So we moved across different social class and race environments that exposed me to the realities of a broader community of South Africans and their reality and what they were experiencing during that time. I also come from a mixed race family, which had a great impact on me. So I come from Afrikaans European descent, mostly German and French descent. And then on my dad's side, I come from Arab descent, which deeply marked his upbringing and his experiences in South Africa and other members of his family. So when I consider myself a part of the global majority, human and more than human, this comes from a space of first being born in the global South, coming from a different geographic perspective, but also coming from a different educational perspective, having grown up with a different worldview to the one that I was educated in for my PhD. And then also coming from a multicultural and multiracial background. And that background also brought me into deep relations with the environment when I was growing up. And I spent a lot of time in nature, building relationships with different animal persons. And so they have played a very strong role in my research, particularly through my PhD and beyond. And increasingly, I like to include them as part of the community that I not only write about, but do scholarship with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important to give them not only a shout out, but kind of foregrounding because as our more than human kin, a lot of the times they are silent participants in our research, or maybe they're very loud participants, but they're not participants that can uh, write or read, or that their perspective doesn't get translated into the institution, or it's up to us to get their perspective translated into the institution. So I really appreciate you including them in your introduction.
Yes, and I recently have started including my dogs at the bottom of my class syllabi, and noting that my work is developed in concert with them because they really have been companions throughout my academic journey and continue to support me in this work in very nuanced ways.
Yes, in nuanced ways, absolutely. And they're always there too.
Yes.
So lovely. So can you talk a little bit about your research and how maybe you can share your dissertation research and your work with the San Bushmen, and speaking of translation, kind of how you're theoretically translating that into this sort of Western worldview or um, uh, Western model of education.
Yeah. So my dissertation topic was not one that was clear to me when I started my PhD. Given my background in what was clear to me is that I wanted to bring my background in both history and media making and formal communications into my dissertation. And I wanted to bring, or rather to have a strong emphasis on narratology. So I really love documentary filmmaking. I worked with documentary films for many years. And I wanted to emphasize the use of documentary films in scholarly analysis. So that was clear to me. Originally, I thought I would work on topics more related to food sovereignty and agricultural systems because I'd been working in the corporate sector in that environment and had traveled across the globe, meeting different kinds of food producers and agriculturalists and farmers from rural communities to corporate agricultural communities. But as I dug deeper and deeper into that work, I began to understand that the questions I had about our food system and our relationship to food essentially begged deeper questions relating to humans in the more than human world. So whether that be our geological, ecological, or biological environment. And that with those questions, I began to think more and more about our first sort of or primary ancestors. So the first peoples and nations of the place where I was born in South Africa, which would have been the San Bushmen. And I began to think about their relationship to animals through hunting practices. San and Bushman are both colonial terms that I think it's important to point out. Bushman originally was a term that emerged during the colonial period of genocide and was originally a derogatory term. and fell out of academic favor in the early post-colonial academic setting. San, which is essentially a Nama word, it's not a word that is in the vocabulary of those clans themselves, was the chosen word that academia adopted in order to replace Bushmen. There's problematics in the use of both terms, and today, when I speak to my mentors and co-researchers, they are increasingly taking on the term Bushman again as a self-identifier. And so I use the word San Bushman, and there are several scholars in my field that have chosen to adopt that those two terms together as a way to signify an evolving identity amongst communities on the ground. So that aside, my research originally began by looking at the archive. So Bushmen are individuals who've been widely studied in, sometimes very inappropriate ways by evolutionary science and biology and by anthropology for more than 150 years. And they've also been the subject of early society formation. So a lot of the early research on human evolution and the evolution of human societies was conducted through the Kalahari Harvard Research Group amongst people in Southern Africa. So there's a large body of ethnographic data that exists around hunting practices over long periods of time through changing societal experiences. So I interrogated that material in concert with filmographic material created by the environmentalist Craig Foster. And I really attempted to look at the metaphysics of what was taking place during a hunt, particularly the most challenging forms of a hunt where a hunter runs an animal down to exhaustion or to its death. And I looked at both the ecological implications for what underpins this type of practice, but also the spiritual implications and what those could teach us today in our relationships with other human beings. This really brought me into a deep reading of new animist theory, which has been widely applied in places like Siberia, or more particularly in Latin America, by a variety of different scholars, but less so within the African context and less so within the context of the San. So I worked with a San Bushman scholar, Dr. Matthias Günther, who's really the first scholar to publish multiple volumes of work on the application of new animist theory to this particular culture. And that sort of led me more broadly into exploring transspecies ontology, which is a topic I'm deeply interested in, and to also looking more broadly metaphysically at this idea of ontological mutability or ontological fluidity, and what that can teach us today in a time of dramatic climate change, and what assuming a perspective of ontological fluidity can do for assisting us with climate adaptation, so to speak. So that's really the academic basis and framing for my research, although there's other aspects to that. Once I completed my dissertation, I really found a huge disconnect, and I still feel this disconnect quite strongly between the theoretical exploration of the work that I do and the social reality and implications of what is going on amongst communities today in a very contemporary setting, and what their experiences and interests and needs are.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. So just a couple of points of clarification to our audience. So you mentioned that you worked with Craig Foster. And so just so everybody knows, that is the person, the individual who created My Octopus Teacher, correct?
Yes, that is correct. So, in his recent book, Amphibious Soul, he actually talks a lot about the films that he made amongst the San Bushmen. That's the first time that he actually has spoken about those projects in many decades. Those projects were made in 2000 and 2010. And so Craig was really gracious enough to send me extended discs, not only with the forms themselves, that they're not available online, but also with a lot of side interviews, filmographic materials that were made by him and his brother when they made those films at the time. And then commentary by different San Bushman scholars on the film itself. So that really provided me with a rich body of work to work with. And then he was also gracious enough to, have several calls with me to talk about this work.
Wow. So his work before he did My Octopus Teacher was with the San Bushmen, or he was working alongside them at the same time, or?
Yeah, so Craig was one of the only people him and his brother, Damon Foster, were one of the only people to film a chasing hunt in its
Oh,
entirety.
right.
And so that film was the film that came out in 2000. And then in 2010, Kumani-san community actually asked him and his brother to accompany them in one of their elders being initiated into a hunt, someone who'd not had the opportunity to have that experience. So those two films now, were sort of made before the mass digital era, before things like Netflix.
Yeah.
And so that
Yeah.
that work in some ways is archival documentary film work. But it continues to inform his work today. And actually, Craig's organization, Sea Change, does do a lot of work with contemporary San communities today in the space of tracking. So, um, you know, one of the things that Craig learned from San Bushman individuals was the art and skill of tracking, which he continued to practice and work on throughout these past few decades. And so he now works with youth who've not had the ability to connect with their culture to
Mm.
reintroduce them to tracking skills.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's such important work. And so the other point of clarification I wanted to bring to our audience is that so the San Bushmen, so tracking as it's currently in its current form in the United States, one of the main people to bring this kind of tracking to the United States was Tom Brown and John Young, if I'm correct, right? And so I just think
Right.
it's really interesting that, this indigenous community is so central to um, uh, teaching tr this kind of traditional ecological knowledge and keeping it alive and spreading it, and especially with other cultures as well.
Yes, and I will highlight that John Young has a very strong relationship with Craig Foster.
Oh,
Um, and that John recently completed last year 2 trips back to the Kalahari Desert and continues to work with San Bushman trackers. So it's a small, tightly knit community.
that's really cool. And then someone else in my circle, her name is Megan Walla Murphy in Northern California. She teaches tracking bears. So yeah, I know that she's connected to that world as well. So you're right, it is a very small, tight-knit community, but it also is really tied to what we've been highlighting in this podcast, which is a very feminist dimension of either scholarship or just ontology or relating to or existence, right? Is the importance of building relationships, right? Strong relationships, and that it
Yes.
is that relationality that is really important. And so I think in the Western institutions, it's a very top-down model, but I think building relationships is a very different way of protecting knowledge, sharing this knowledge. But I do want to go back to something that you mentioned, which I just sensed a little point of, I wouldn't call it tension, but a nuance that I'd like to dive into. And so you said something about social recapitulations and how it's difficult to. So I'll just say in layman's terms, when we work with communities, right? I teach a community engaged learning class at the University of San Francisco, and we always talk about how important it is to develop mutually beneficial relationships. And so I'm wondering if that's the nuance that you were getting into is how to um, build these strong relationships or um, how to work towards Indigenous sovereignty or community engaged um, learning. Is that, or am I just assuming something?
No, no, not at all.
Okay.
And I think that this work has really it hasn't narrowed the scope of that question for me. It's increased the scope of that question for me. And
Okay.
so I spend a lot of time looking at the anthropological archive, right? First I'll say that anthropology developed very differently in distinct parts of the globe. Different anthropological cultures and institutions had very strong impacts on different communities at different time periods. And a lot of that has been damaging in certain instances. And at the same time, there's been a huge effort on the part of anthropology to reform its practices and the way in which scholars participate in their research, not only as research for the sake of the scholar in the institution, but for the sake of the community itself.
Yeah.
And I think that in different parts of the world, we're really starting to see that change in a positive way. I think that in some ways, I feel like the research that has taken place in Southern Africa amongst the San is still very paradoxical and dichotomous. And the nuance of the political and social reality, in concert with the cosmologies and mythologies and religions that we want to study, there's a lot of conflict between those desires and those needs. And so at this point, I don't actually conduct ethnographic research amongst the San. There are plenty of anthropologists that do that. A lot of my research is philosophical, archival, but what I do is I work with San organizations who work in youth development and are tending to social issues.
Mm. Nice.
And that kind of work is not necessarily work that I bring into my scholarship at this point in time. That work is really based on, as you said, building relationships
Mhm.
with communities and individuals. And that work can come across as being very, it's service work in many ways. So I'm part of a group. One of my mentors, who is a Narosan leader and has been running youth development organizations for several decades, Craig Q7 Beckett. I, sort of support and assist his organization and his colleagues in whatever way I can. So whether that's occasionally through financial means, through the money I make through scholarship, or whether that's through, copy editing documents or helping with applications for grants or funds, or advice, or social support or building networks. I've been engaged in that community or group for more than 2 years now, with no end academic objective to that work. Essentially, the objective is to be in community, to understand the needs of community better, and when and if the time arises, to serve that community through the skills that I have.
Mm. That's awesome. Really well said. So that's kind of talking about the practice and on the ground. I want to jump back into the theory because I read your really cool article titled Becoming Earth, Prehumanistic Consciousness and Trans-Species Sentience in the Practice of Tracking. And you introduced on this podcast already the dimension of the Bushmen tracking that Craig Foster videotaped, and you talked about this in your dissertation, which is the hunt and to the point of exhaustion. And first question, how would you categorize this? Would you categorize it as a spiritual experience? That's kind of a Western term, but I'll let you answer the question. So that's the first question. And then the second question is, you already introduced to our audience that you're interested in ontological fluidity. So how does this experience um, demonstrate ontological fluidity?
Mm. Yeah, great. Thank you for those questions. So I'd also like to say here that I'm crossing a lot of disciplines and boundaries. So when I'm engaging in this type of work, and I am in dialogue with classical anthropologists in this field, but I'm not um, presuming that they're going to agree with all of the ways in which I'm theorizing this work. Which is partly why I lean so strongly on and was very insistent on having an advisor on my dissertation that is a scholar who has done very detailed ethnographic fieldwork on this topic over multiple decades. And so I'll say this is where these two things are related. So if I take a classical understanding of tracking, people will notice in all of the articles that I write where I reference tracking, particularly amongst the San Bushmen, I refer to a scholar, Louis Liebenberg, who is the individual who continues to collect the most scientifically grounded data on what tracking is and what people are doing when they're tracking, right? So he is someone who has systematized the process of tracking. He has been the inspiration for the original wisdom school that leads tracking expeditions both in North America and in South Africa, based on the cyber tracking method. And he's also developed an app and a training tool for SON trackers to become formally, quote unquote, trained in order to facilitate game reserves industry with tracking skills. So I'll say that. And there are similar types of programs that take place here in Australia. On that level, he has a way of describing what is taking place in this form of tracking where the boundaries seem to blur between the human, the environment, and the animal, right? Which is his fourth level of tracking. And the way he describes this, and there are also anthropologists who describe similar processes of how tracking takes place in Australia, is what he's essentially describing, that it is the relationship between the ways in which the human understands their physical geography, the environmental factors of that geography, the animal movements and interactions in the ecology of that geography, and that they are in tune enough with all those dimensions to be able to predict how and when an animal will move. Right, so they're not explaining it in overly mystical terms or in spiritual terms. One can see that if one translates this into a more mystical interpretation of this practice, and this is where Dr. Gunther provides us with some language for doing that there is a type of identification that can take place between the tracker and their environment that can extend beyond the practical, sort of survival skills, practical aspects of survival skills. And this is where ontological fluidity takes place. And so Gunther then theorizes that this deep identification with this ongoing process leads to an experience where the ontological boundaries between beings begin to merge, and the hunter then takes on identification of the identity of the animal itself. There are instances where it doesn't necessarily have to be an animal. It could be a tree, it could be a rock. It could be the rain, so it could take place in different forms. And the archive is sort of really rich with stories that discuss this. And so in some ways, the mystical or spiritual aspect actually lies in the ability to let go of human ontological boundaries and the distinction between humans and the other. And
Mm,
this then, there's a way in which this can take place purely on a sort of ontological level, but in the cosmology, there's also a structure, cosmological structure for how this also informs a certain kind of spiritual or mytho-mystical experience.
that's really helpful clarification. And so I'm approaching this through, I've done a little bit of tracking, very beginner tracking, and also through the psychological lens. And through ecopsychology, I find that there are some theorists in the realm of ecopsychology um, that do say the more time you spend in nature, the more connected you feel. And then there's this an ecological self that arises. And so it sounds like this is a much deeper and more primordial connection. But I think that that could be kind of an entrance or a connecting point um,
Yeah.
from kind of the
Absolutely.
yeah.
It really is. And this is, a large part of what I'm attempting to argue as well, is to have us reframe our understanding of that ecological self
Hmm.
as being co-constructed,
Mm,
um, not only through our own intellectual development and evolutionary process, but simply to argue that our evolutionary process is so deeply informed
mm,
by the ecological environment that surrounds us. And this is where I increasingly draw on the continually emerging archaeology and paleoanthropology that is beginning to indicate in very nuanced ways that animals and the environment have and had a lot more to do with human evolution than we have given them credit for. And so one of the anthropologists who continues to do a lot of work with San Bushmen communities, and he helped establish the Kwaitu Museum in the Western Cape for the San. His name is Chris Lowe, and his work really attempts to argue that we evolved out of ecological embeddedness.
mm,
And so it's
mm,
not us that shaped the environment, it's the environment that shaped us, and
mm,
it's the environment that informed who we are.
mhm,
And I also draw on scholars who are increasingly calling for us to look at the animal archive, not only the human archive, where there is sufficient evidence at this point to indicate that our understanding of ritual
mm.
and our understanding of ritualized processes may have even been informed by other species, and that this is not merely a human-making process.
Wow, I've never heard that. So rituals are informed by animals. So, and this is where I think language doesn't, it can get kind of choppy because what I want to say is, oh, so were they talking to us and like telling us what rituals to do? And it's like yes and no, but what would you say to that question?
I'd say that the anthropological evidence right now really it talks to a much simpler process of observation.
Mm,
Right, and learning
yeah.
through a sharing of space and a cohabitation and coexistence.
Mm,
So this also talks to some of the things that Tim Ingold has been trying to say when he talks about an ontology of dwelling. And essentially, all of these scholars are attempting to get to the same thing, which is to say that humans evolved in concert with other beings, and each of those species informed each other back and forth.
mhm,
And that this, was a relational process that took place over long periods of time. And that this idea that we somehow evolved independently not being influenced by our environment and the other sort of creatures that cohabited the planet with us, that in some ways that's a preposterous thought, because that also means we must have been entirely non-observant and isolated and have shut ourselves off, from the rest of the world, which is what we're doing now. This is
Exactly.
what we've evolved into. But scholars are arguing that's not who we've been until recently. Who we've
Wow.
been has been a very different kind of human.
Yeah. Until maybe 100 years ago, which in the evolutionary development of the human species, 200,000 years, 100 years is a blip. So, um,
Right.
but as you're talking, I'm thinking about how important it is or how poignant it is that we're embarking on species extinction. Because if we have developed this co-evolutionary relationship with ontological relationship with the natural world, that the fact that species are going extinct, I'm not making this, I don't want to make this an anthropocentric argument, but what does that mean for us, right? But that is a question, right, as a human.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that is a big question. I want to be careful in how one responds to that question,
Mm,
but except to say that I think that there are psychological implications of
right.
that we don't fully
Yeah.
understand.
Good.
In layman's terms, Craig Foster talks about this a lot, the psychological trauma that we are experiencing due to our separation from other species and our biological environment. And more sort of, paleoanthropologists are also talking about this and talking to this, that in many ways we are not well evolved for our current sort of human experience, and that we are better evolved for a human experience where we are in deeper relationship with other species. So the more that we continue to drive the extinction of these species and separate ourselves from them, what does that mean? I don't know if we know how to answer that in Western terms. I think that I could point to, the ways in which perhaps Aboriginal scholars would talk to what that does spiritually
Mm,
and psychologically, due to the fact that in their worldview and their system, each clan and each individual has responsibility through, the identification with a totem. That not only means, it's not totemism, is a very problematic idea in Western thought. And it's
mm,
not this, oh, what is my animal power? It's this deep understanding of that species and the role that that species plays in an ecosystem, and also the understanding of how to care for that species.
right.
Knowing that that I don't have the ability to know all things about all animals. And so in different indigenous cultures, and this was once the same, within San Bushman society, individuals would understand particular things about a particular species that was associated with them or their clan, and that would contribute to a greater uh, relationship of care between humans and the more than human world.
Right. So in your article, you're talking about, you use the term post-humanism. And so you say that our post-humanist future depends on a pre-humanist understanding of interspecies consciousness. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about. So can you talk about futurity in terms of the implications of your research, right? So if we have this ontological connection to the more than human world, and you gestured towards it in terms of what this does for climate adaptation. Um, but can you just flush out for our audience this idea of post-humanism and the future implications of your work?
Yeah, I mean, there's many ways to sort of frame post-humanism. I frame post-humanism more within the context of anthropocentrism, and in responding to anthropocentric humanism.
Okay.
And I think if one talks about, pre-human consciousness and post-humanism, essentially we're struggling with and wrestling with this idea of humanism to start with.
Mm,
And so we're really
mm,
talking about an idea that emerged, as you said, fairly recently. This is a very our understanding of humanism is deeply tied to the Enlightenment period and a particular framing of scientific and materialist understanding of the world, where
mm,
the human becomes distinct within a broader community of beings, and where the human takes on not only a certain superiority in intellectual ability, but the right to dominate and to enforce dominion over other species. And this is not, as many people argue, simply a theological argument. This is an argument created through scientific materialism, right? That is
right.
premised on our superiority as a species. And so post-humanism in that context is really to deconstruct this idea that we are superior on all levels. And this can be really tricky and gets into many debates with people. And one of the biggest debates here is a good example of that would be the debate of language, where we continue to argue that we are the only species that invented language in the way that we did and are able to communicate in ways that we are, and to develop symbolic consciousness. And
Mhm,
the language debate comes to this idea of symbolic consciousness, and so a lot of this theory was developed, through actually anthropology's sort of being the daughter of a certain philosophical form of thinking. And it's very patriarchal thinking, it's very hierarchical thinking. And so, post-humanists, for example, would argue that, well, are you telling me that a species like the whale that's been on the planet for 40 million years and can communicate through sound across hundreds of kilometers underwater, that they do not have an advanced form of language or symbolic thinking? And the more scientists are now able to talk about whale language and to study whale language, whale song, whale communication, amongst other species, where this idea of human superiority is breaking down.
mhm,
Part of my work, and not just mine, but the scholars that I lean on, their work, is to argue that in order to break down this understanding of humanism, we can't only think post, right? There's no linear formation of time here. We need to think about time in a circular way, past, present, and future together. And in that understanding, we need to consider ourselves, our sapient selves, from the perspective of hunter-gatherers, because that's what we were for the majority of our existence on this human planet, and to consider that consciousness.
mm,
And that consciousness should be included in the considerations of the post-humanistic self.
mm,
Because if we don't include that consciousness in our understanding of post-humanism, we risk creating another kind of hierarchy or some sort of structure that, once again, is not in concert or in relation with the natural environment around us or the biological environment around us.
mm. Can you say a little bit more about reinscribing the hierarchy? How would that happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of people are arguing that that's what's taking place in the way that we're developing AI,
Oh, definitely.
or the way that we're treating artificial intelligence, or not consciously thinking about the way that we're involving or evolving artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
I also think that the other way that it takes place is that if there isn't a sort of methodological or theoretical, even a cosmological grounding for what constitutes the human before humanism, then we end up relying back on a materialism. So we keep coming back to materialist understandings of ourselves, even in our expression of ourselves as post-human, because we're relying on the only language that we have.
Mm,
So it's more to this point that we need to really dig deep into different expressions of the human before we understood ourselves to be human.
mm,
And whether we get that, from understanding ancient communities or pre-human beings, or whether we get that through engaging with different earth-based cultures or indigenous cultures, we need to continue to strive to find ways to increase our vocabulary, lest we continue to fall back on a scientific deterministic perspective.
God, that was really well said. Thank you for that clarification. And so you also talked about, you cite Rosie Predotti in um, saying that our future is radically imminent. Can you say a little, or this radical imminence? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, and so I'm not going to speak specifically to the different ways that Rosie uses that, but there's also a lot of philosophical debate around the way that the term or word eminence is used. But essentially, in a post-humanistic context, the idea here is to really move away from our tendency to work towards transcendence
Mm,
as being aligned with progress, right? So
yeah.
that our progress as a human being is dependent on being transcendent, which essentially takes us out of our bodies, out of the earth, and towards something that is above and beyond
Mm,
our planetary community. And that could include, for example, the propagation of, psychedelic journeys and psychedelic cultures. And, I know that there are many people that speak against the ways in which European and modern and Western societies have tended to emphasize transcendent. Oh, I've got tongue tied there. To
transcend, yeah.
yeah, to emphasize transcendence as a means to liberation, right? It's
Right.
embedded in a lot of our theology, it's embedded in a lot of our worldviews, whether we realize it or not. So the eminence here, both in Brodotti's post-humanism and also in the way that anthropologists refer to it, is again to call us back to ecological embeddedness
Yeah.
and to call us back into ecological relationship. And it's also an indication of a flattening of that hierarchy. So, in other words, um, each thing that is eminent to something else and to itself
Mm,
is on the same level as the other, so to speak. So we're not sitting in superior relationship to the earth. We ourselves become ourselves through our um, eminent relationship with the co-evolution of other beings
yeah.
and the earth itself.
That, so you talk about in your article this idea of, and I think you cite Sutton and Walsh, re-envisioning advancement. And I think that's tied to moving away from transcendence, which, in this podcast, we talk about the natural world and then we also talk about theory. And there's a lot of um, re-envisioning spirituality or religious institutions, and because a lot of them have been monotheistic or Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are these monotheistic traditions that the God is transcendent over and above the earth. And so even in wilderness culture, a lot of the methodology is to kind of push through the pain and have these transcendent peak experiences. And that's fine, but then the integration and embodiment is the missing component. And so it's interesting to hear you talk about that theoretically and how it applies to some of the things we've been talking about in this podcast. Um, but this will be the last question. In terms of, I really liked when you talked about Sutton and Walsh and re-envisioning advancement, because instead of having these ideas that the human superiority complex, right? We are so much, we're so different, and we exist over and above the natural world. We're better than all of these other species. And then that justifies our domination. Uh, but re-envisioning these as perhaps developing traditional ecological knowledges. And so is that kind of what they're talking about in terms of re-envisioning advancement?
Yes, definitely. There's a lot more talk about this, and it's I want to say these are very contested debates. And if we're sitting, you know, in our chairs or coming from the perspective that we're coming from, in the work that you do and teach, the work that I do and teach, and maybe, you know, from the perspective of ecology and religion at the, you know, American Academy of Religion. These do not seem like very contentious conversations or very contentious debates. But these debates are essentially asking us to reframe the way we viewed the entirety of history.
Yeah.
And so I want to say, because I think it's important to say, this book that you're referring to that I reference, called Farmers or Hunter-Gatherers, is part of a very complex debate where Sutton and Walsh have also been criticized in nuanced ways for being part of an old school anthropology. And that debate is, you know, this gets back to the politics of the day. This debate is tied to a larger debate that has been taking place for the last decade in Australia, where anthropology was accused of continually framing Aboriginal peoples as primitive.
Mm.
And about 10 years ago, a scholar of Aboriginal descent, well, he's was more of a journalist and writer than a formal scholar, wrote a book called Dark Emu, which used colonial archives to demonstrate that Aboriginal peoples were practicing advanced agricultural practices and advanced engineering practices upon time of contact. And the whole attempt of this book was to reframe the narrative about the ingenuity of Aboriginal people and their so-called primitiveness. Part of what Sutton and Walsh are doing, and I think this is important, it may seem nuanced for some people, but I think this is really important. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to ask, should we not be reframing the way that we view hunter-gatherer in the first place, right? So why is hunter-gatherer still at the bottom of this pyramid? And why do you need to be an agriculturalist to be
Mm.
considered civilized, or to be considered to have moved along a linear, you know, procession of progress? And so what they're trying to argue, and they use tracking in order to demonstrate this, is that in order to be a successful survivor of hunter-gatherer society or culture, that you actually need to demonstrate the most advanced forms of human capability that exist, full
Mm.
stop, right? And they say that, you know, when colonists first came and experienced the abilities of Aboriginal trackers, that these seemed superstitious and supernatural, that it was not possible for a
Mm.
human to be able to understand and to sort of supernaturally determine what was going on in the environment in this way. And of course, there's many, you know, there's problematics as to how we then in the West interpreted these practices, and we often demonize them. And so I think the nuance of that debate is something that I would like to see expanded, not only
Mm.
in archaeology and anthropology, but I think a lot more broadly, you know, in discussions of ecology and religion and environmental humanities, and in the post-humanities, right? Is why do we still care so little about understanding the skills of
Mm.
our ancestors, who have been the most successful, skills to help us survive over, you know, hundreds of thousands of years? We're still not that interested in how we survived as those beings, and we're much more interested in, you know, how we've built and crashed empires over the last 10,000 years and engaged in warfare. But, I'd like to see a lot more of a reframing of hunter-gatherer as actually being perhaps the highest form of
Yeah.
what the human can be in terms of our relationship with the more than human world.
Yeah, absolutely, because it allows one or enforces or it that ontological fluidity is embedded in the hunter-gatherer way. And I think about this when I'm backpacking. I think about this because I've lived out of my car sometimes, and it's almost like our culture of domination, the settler colonial vision, reinforces this idea that we have to have one very particular address, right? There's all of these very subtle ways that settler colonialism inscribes itself. It's unconscious kind of push to be like, this is the highest form, no questions asked. Uh,
Right.
and so that lack of interest in engaging in these skills and to understand the skills, there has to be, well, I wouldn't say there has to be because I feel like you understand these skills very well, at least the ontological dimension of them. But the engagement is how you become animal. And
Right.
so that's the embodied and embedded dimension of this ontological fluidity. So fascinating.
Yeah.
I could talk to you forever. I really could. This is so cool. I love how you're bridging the theory with the practice as well. And so I did say that that was my last question, but to kind of ground it in this radical immanence, I would love for you to talk about some sort of practice. And so I know um, you're living in Australia right now. And so if you wanted to kind of close talking about some of the Indigenous sovereignty and ecological restoration work being done there.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, this is another dimension of my work that I'm really interested in is what are Indigenous communities doing today to re-inform their sovereignty on a political, economic, cultural, and spiritual level, right? And of course, these things are all intertwined. One of the ways in which I studied this, and I'll be publishing on this later this year, is looking at the rights of rivers in the Southeast, on Turtle Island in North America, and looking very specifically at what tribes in Virginia and North Carolina are doing. What I find here in Australia, and of course, again, this is part of a much bigger, more complex debate, is that although Aboriginal peoples are considered, in many ways by the law inferior and still treated in a politically inferior manner, and particularly by the judicial system and the sort of education system, there are also ways in which, due to the particular nature of this settler nation state, that there's a lot more funding for formal government institutions to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into scientific projects.
Oh,
And since the 1990s, there's a process that has been unfolding where Aboriginal communities can claim native title. And this native title is often claimed over large areas that would be put under conservation protection. And so I'm interested in the practical ways in which communities, despite their political position, are finding sort of secondary ways to work with conservation authorities or with local councils in order to put their traditional ecological knowledge into practice for not only the betterment of their community, but for the betterment of the environment, and as they often state, for all of Australia. This is really a sort of stance and an attitude they take. The one way in which one can demonstrate this to be practiced is there's a book that I always share with both my undergraduate and graduate students, and it's really a book that everyone loves. And my mother-in-law recently read it and also loved it, called Fire Country, written by a scholar and filmmaker called Victor Stephenson, where he talks about the process of not only revitalizing Aboriginal fire practices, but the way in which his organization, Fire Sticks, is working with states, working with local councils, and working with private individuals who own a lot of land in order to begin to bring these practices back to the land and care for country in ways that is in alignment with Aboriginal law. So there's a lot of that type of work that is taking place in Australia, despite the many political challenges that they are experiencing, and a really important scholar that actually works in the field of post-humanism that I follow, Dr. Daryl Rigney. He's a Ngarrindjeri man from South Australia. He actually just recently, it's coming out later this year, just published a book on Indigenous nation building in Australia, called Resistance, Resilience, Resurgence, and Indigenous Self-Rule. And he talks about the ways in which his community, despite lack of treaty on a national or state level, how his community has managed to work through essentially a structure of corporate MOUs
Mm.
with councils and with government institutions in order to enforce different types of nation building and Indigenous sovereignty. So I'm also, that's work that I'm also really interested in. And I'll sort of finish that by saying that I'm increasingly interested in how rites of passage and I'm thinking more and more about women's rites of passage, specifically the role that they play for, whether this is now in Southern Africa or Turtle Island or Australia, the role that they play contemporarily for communities today, right? So if I go back into the archive and I look at some of these rites of passage, I can theorize ontological fluidity and in these rites of passage. But what is revitalizing, reinstituting, finding ways to practice these rites of passage today? What does that mean for, and what is that doing for those communities today as it pertains to Indigenous sovereignty?
All right, Chantel, Dr. Forbes. So when you were talking about women's rites of passage, I received what you have written about a bodily tapping. I don't know what the technical term means, but I felt a bodily tapping. So I hope that you and I can continue a conversation on women's rites of passage as
Great.
gesturing towards that movement of ontological fluidity, because I obviously feel called to this work, or else I wouldn't have this podcast. And
Yes,
a lot of nuances about doing rites of passage and so doing it the right way. That's a future conversation we're going to have. So thank you.
great.
And so I will put a link to the two books that you referenced in the show notes. So Fire Country, Resistance, Resilience, and Resurgence. And then in closing, what are some of your last words for our audience? And if there's any links that you would like me to include, you can go ahead and kind of promote your work. This is the like and subscribe to Dr. Forbes moment.
Well, I'll give you my website, chantelnoa.com, and people can sort of look up my email address if they want to be in touch with me there, or just look at some of the things that I've been doing and my history. I think in terms of last words, what I'd really like to emphasize is that we are really in this moment now of huge civilizational change. And I don't think that we have experienced a moment like this in many thousands of years. And I think that when we move through the world as we are now, where things are very politically difficult and socially challenging, that it is important to remember that and to think about how our ancestors moved through time periods like this. And this is where I really cannot overemphasize the importance of history and the importance of ancestral knowledge. And when I say that, I mean all of our ancestral knowledge. And so I would just really encourage people to take a step back and to zoom out and to contemplate those thoughts and integrate them into your daily practices as we move through this challenging time. And, we are at this time period where the supremacy of humanism is at the edge of crumbling,
Yeah.
right? And so what's next? What's next is what we put forward, how we show up in the world, and how we choose to form new structures of society and community.
Mm.
And so I think it's just important to be conscious about the fact that as we go about our daily tasks and our daily work, that we're all contributing to that bigger process, and to think of that as a sacred task.
Mhm. That's a great place to end, considering that is a sacred task. Thank you so much. That was really powerful. Thank you so much for your words and your time and your research.
Thank you, Kim, for having me. I really appreciate it.
This podcast has been brought to you in collaboration with the Luce Foundation, the American Academy of Religion, and the Wild Women nonprofit. Thanks so much for joining us. Please follow us so you can keep returning to the fire. And in the meantime, be wild and be well.